Welcome back to How to Value a Business for Sale in 2022, Part 4, which today I'll be looking at the third valuation approach called the asset approach. Now, if you remember correctly, our first valuation approaches that we looked at were the income approach, which looks at the cash flows to the subject company, the market approach, which compares our subject company to other similar or comparable companies, and today looking at the asset, or also known as the cost approach. This is an approach where effectively we look at the cost, if you will, to replicate or reproduce the assets and liabilities of a company. So let's have a look at my whiteboard again as an example. Under the asset or the cost approach, what we need to think about or what we need to consider to come up with the value of a business is for each and every asset and liability within the business. In this case, let's use my whiteboard as an example. What is the cost to reproduce or replicate this asset? So in the case of the whiteboard here, for example, I could go out and buy another whiteboard. So cost to replace it might be, let's say, $10. Now, I could also reproduce that myself by going out and buying all the materials necessary to reproduce this whiteboard. But that might be quite expensive because I don't make whiteboards every day. So the value of this whiteboard under the asset approach would be equal to the cost to replicate it through going out and purchasing another whiteboard for, say, $10. So that's effectively the premise under the asset or cost approach, which once we have the value of each of the individual assets and liabilities, we then need to perform an accounting equation to identify the value of the business. So we then go back to a very base accounting equation which says that the value of all the assets in a business is funded by or equal to liabilities plus our equity. So the sum of all the values of the assets is funded by or equal to the sum of all the liabilities and the equity that is funding those assets. So when we're valuing a company, this is the number that we're interested in coming up with, typically speaking, where we want to identify the equity or the share value of that company. So once we've identified the value of all the assets using the asset and cost approach, as mentioned, through things such as cost to reproduce or replicate, we then minus the value of all our liabilities, things like bank debt, loans, etc., and then anything left over, that is how we identify the equity value of our subject company under the asset approach. Now again, comparatively compared to the income and market approach, there's a time and a place for the asset approach, and it may not be applicable to value all business types. Again, this comes down to the appraiser or the valuer's expertise, depends on factors such as industry, but it is certainly one of the approaches that we always consider when valuing businesses at InteleK. See you in the next video where I'll be talking about different valuation purposes and how they may potentially impact the process of evaluation.